She vanished without a trace, a young forest ranger missing in the dead of winter. The news spread fast, fear spreading faster. Snow fell. Time ran out. Then a retired Navy SEAL stepped out of the forest, alone, silent. He heard what others ignored. He saw what others missed. What he uncovered wasn't just a crime, it was a countdown, a mountain ready to collapse, a village about to disappear. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter tightened its grip on a small mountain town, pressing silence into the trees and frost into every breath. Beyond the last plowed road, a lone cabin stood watch over a forest that remembered more than it revealed. Jack Miller woke before dawn, not because he needed to, but because stillness had become a language his body understood. The cabin complained softly in the cold, wood contracting, nails whispering, as if the structure itself were uneasy with what lay beyond its walls. Jack sat on the edge of the bed and listened, letting the quiet pass through him without resistance. At his feet, the dog waited. No movement, no sound, just presence. They had learned long ago that mornings did not need words. He brewed coffee strong enough to sting and stood at the window watching fresh snow erase yesterday's tracks. Clean landscapes made people feel safe. Jack knew that now. War had taught him that clean usually meant hidden. He dressed out of habit rather than necessity, the uniform settling on him like an old truth he no longer argued with. Outside, the dog paused at the door, sampling the air, reading the cold the way Jack once read streets and rooftops. Jack waited, hand on the frame, letting the animal decide when the world was ready. The road into town cut a thin line through white, a compromise between wilderness and order. Jack walked without urgency. Urgency led to mistakes. In the market, heat and noise collided awkwardly, boots thudded against tile, and voices braided themselves into something louder than conversation. Jack gathered what he needed without thinking, hands moving with practiced efficiency, while the dog kept its quiet watch. It was the tone that reached him first, not the words. A strain beneath the chatter, worry rubbing against disbelief. Third day now. She wouldn't just disappear? Forest Service said. Jack slowed, not visibly, but inside. The dog stilled. Then the words surfaced, carried on a breath that held too much fear to be casual. A ranger. Missing. Jack paid and stepped back into the cold without asking a single question. Questions pulled threads. Threads led places Jack had spent years avoiding. The climb back toward the cabin felt heavier. Halfway up, memory finished what it had started days earlier. He remembered the sound. A low concussion swallowed by snowfall, too deep to be falling trees, too deliberate to be chance. He had paused then, axe frozen mid-swing, listening for a second echo that never came. Silence had let him believe what was convenient. At the cabin, supplies remained untouched. Jack stood with one hand on the table, feeling the grain beneath his palm, and let the truth settle without argument. This was not curiosity. This was responsibility. He did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns waiting for someone to admit they existed. He left again without ceremony. No map, no radio, just what had followed him through other winters. The dog rose, instantly, as if the decision had been made long before Jack caught up to it. The forest received them without comment. Snow softened their steps, but Jack read what lay beneath it, compressions where none should be, breaks in the surface that disagreed with the lie of fresh fall. He moved slowly, letting the dog range just far enough to listen ahead, just far enough to guide Jack's attention without pulling it. The air shifted a mile in. Jack felt it tighten behind his ribs, a familiar pressure he had known in places where geometry and violence negotiated quietly. He knelt and brushed snow aside. The mark beneath was straight, intentional. Nearby, ice-crusted fragments lay scattered, sharp-edged, wrong. He did not name them yet. The dog stopped, not alarmed, focused. Jack followed that line to a drift piled against a fallen spruce. Something dark interrupted the white. His fingers closed around metal cold enough to burn. The shape told him what it was before his mind caught up. A badge. A few feet farther, half buried, a laminated ID stared back at him, cracked by cold, the face steady in a way only people used to trees rather than crowds ever were. Jack did not breathe for a moment. He turned the badge once, then again, fixing its weight in memory, then slid both items into his pocket. The echo returned, louder now, demanding recognition, pressure, rock, force applied where it should never be. He stood, every sense narrowing. Whoever had been here had not panicked. They had planned. They had trusted the forest to keep their secrets. At the edge of a shallow ravine, Jack paused. The dog's posture shifted, courage without noise. Jack rested a hand at the back of its neck, not to restrain, but to anchor. He thought of the town below, of voices already turning worry into rumor, rumor into forgetting. He thought of the woman whose name he did not yet speak, and of a forest trying very hard to erase her. Jack turned back before the light failed. Some things were better done with daylight behind you and darkness ahead. At the cabin, he laid the badge and ID on the table and stared until they stopped feeling like objects and became a promise. He slept lightly. The dog did not sleep at all. When dawn came, thin and pale, Jack was already awake. Winter pressed in from all sides. This time, Jack pressed back, not with noise or haste, but with the quiet resolve of a man who knew the forest was listening and intended to answer. Night clung to the tree line, and the snow carried sound the way a chapel carries prayer, muffling it until only intention remained. In the cabin's thin warmth, a badge and an ID lay on the table, like evidence and accusation. Jack Miller did not sleep so much as drift in shallow water, the kind where any movement below could brush the skin. Each time the wind leaned into the logs, his mind answered with a different noise. That low concussion from days ago, the market's worried voices, the quiet finality of the ranger's identification card staring up at him. He told himself to rest, because rest was tactical, because fatigue turned instincts into guesses. But his body refused to believe the night was safe. The dog stayed near the door, not tense, not frantic, simply committed to listening, and Jack felt a familiar shame at how much he depended on that vigilance. Once, teams had watched his blind angles. Now a single animal did, without resentment, without ego, with a devotion that made Jack feel both protected and exposed. Near dawn, he rose, not with urgency but with inevitability, and placed the badge and ID in a sealed pouch, as if careful handling could preserve more than plastic and metal. He considered going to the authorities. He pictured fluorescent offices, paperwork, well-meaning questions, and the slow grind of procedure that winter would outpace. He had lived long enough to know that the world often mistook motion for progress. Out here, progress had to be measured in minutes of body heat and inches of visibility. He also knew something else, quieter but sharper. Whoever left those items behind had done it confidently. Confident people did not fear paperwork. They feared interruption. Jack packed as if for a short patrol, because admitting it might become more was a superstition he could not afford. He left the cabin at first light with the dog at his side, and the forest met them with the same blank face it wore when it buried mistakes under fresh snow. Jack followed yesterday's line carefully, not trusting his own tracks, to remain honest. He moved slower than he wanted, forcing himself to breathe, to let his eyes do what they were trained to do: find what did not belong. Every so often the dog paused, not to admire the world, but to weigh it, and Jack learned again that the animal's stillness was not indecision, but calculation. When they reached the ravine's edge, Jack descended with caution, choosing steps that would not announce him to anyone listening. There were signs of human work tucked into the landscape like guilt. A slice through a small sapling too clean for weather, a length of frayed cord frozen into a drift, a patch of snow that looked smooth until you stared long enough to see it had been tamped down and recovered. Jack kept his gloved fingers away from everything that might smear a story. He did not know yet who would need to read it, but he knew the forest had already tried to rewrite it once. The dog's attention sharpened, then angled left, and Jack felt his own pulse answer. They moved toward a stand of evergreens where the wind traveled differently, as though the trees were shielding something delicate or damned. Jack caught the first scent before he saw the source, iron and cold, and the faint chemical bite that did not belong to wood smoke or pine. His mind offered possibilities, and he refused the comforting ones. The dog's posture shifted again, a warning without noise, and Jack steadied his hand on the animal's shoulder, not to restrain, but to promise, "I see it too." Beyond a low rise, half sheltered by branches loaded with snow, the ground dipped into a pocket of shadow. There the missing ranger lay where the forest had tried to keep her. She was not posed by nature. She was placed. Jack's first emotion was not fear, but anger so tight it felt like discipline. Anger was safer than grief. Grief made men careless. He approached slowly, speaking under his breath in a tone meant more for his own steadiness than for hers, because silence could be a weapon, and he refused to let it be the only one in the clearing. The dog moved ahead a step, then stopped, ears tuned to distances Jack could not measure, and Jack trusted that pause more than he trusted his own optimism. He knelt beside the woman and saw what winter had done, the pale slackness of skin, the bruised mapping of violence, the stiffened clothing that held on to cold like a debt. But he also saw the smallest sign that changed everything, the way her breath fogged the air in a thin, stubborn thread when the wind shifted. She was alive, barely, and the fact felt like a verdict. Jack's hands moved with the competence of muscle memory, but his mind kept slipping into something softer and more dangerous, the part of him that remembered carrying wounded friends into helicopters and then watching the rotors lift them away while he stayed behind. He checked her pulse, faint but present, and for a moment he hated the world for making survival feel like a gamble. The dog lowered its head close to the ranger, not sniffing like an animal searching for information, but hovering like a guard, deciding whether hope was allowed. Jack removed his outer layer and wrapped it around her, cursing himself for how thin the gesture felt against the vastness of the cold. He tried to rouse her with careful pressure, speaking her name once after reading it off the ID, as if names could tether a person to their body. Her eyelids fluttered. When she focused, it was not relief that appeared first, but vigilance, the trained response of someone whose job required doubt. Her lips moved, and at first Jack heard nothing but wind. He leaned closer, feeling the dog's attention tighten, as if the animal too understood that this moment mattered. The ranger's voice arrived as a rasp, broken by ice and pain, and yet it carried intent like a flare. "Someone else," she whispered, and the words struck Jack in a place he had kept armored for years. Still in danger. Jack wanted to ask who, where, how many, but he heard the truth beneath her sentence. She had been trying to protect something bigger than herself, and she had failed only in the way brave people fail when the world brings too much weight at once. He swallowed the questions because she was slipping, because interrogation was not rescue, because he knew the cruelty of asking a dying person to do more work. He told her only what mattered. He was taking her out. She tried to shake her head, a small denial that cost her strength, and Jack felt an old, bitter familiarity in the impulse to refuse help, the belief that accepting it would somehow worsen the outcome for others. He thought of his own past, of orders followed and orders refused, of the nights afterward when every choice returned like a witness. He did not argue with her. He promised her. Promises were dangerous, but so was leaving her here. He shifted her carefully, lifting her in a way that kept her airway clear and her head supported, and the dog pressed close, not underfoot, not frantic, simply matching Jack's movement as if they were joined by a single purpose. Jack began the slow climb out of the pocket, each step heavy with the knowledge that time was now an enemy he could not shoot. The ranger's breath hitched against his chest, thin and uncertain, and Jack fought the urge to panic by turning his focus into math. Distance to the cabin, wind direction, the best line through the trees. He spoke to the dog in short, steady words, less command than companionship, and the animal responded by staying close, scanning, pausing, when the forest sounded wrong, then moving again when it sounded merely empty. Halfway back, Jack felt the smallest tremor run through the ground, a deep vibration like a distant drum. He stopped, heart tightening, and the dog froze at the same instant. The tremor faded quickly, but it left behind a terrible certainty. The noise from days ago had not been a tree falling, not the casual violence of weather. It had been something engineered, something buried, something that could happen again. Jack reached the cabin by late morning, breath burning, arms numb, and laid the ranger near the stove with the care of someone placing a fragile truth into the only warmth he owned. He started a fire, melted snow, stabilized her as best he could with what he had, and the dog remained at her side, watching her chest rise and fall as if counting each breath like prayer beads. Jack considered calling for help again, but the ranger's whisper clung to him, and the tremor underfoot clung even harder. He knew that whatever had put her out there was not finished, and he knew that once he involved the slow machinery of towns and offices, he might lose the only advantage he had: immediacy. He sat back on his heels, exhaustion pressing into his skull, and forced himself to choose the next right thing without letting fear choose it for him. The ranger's eyes opened once more, clearer for a heartbeat, and Jack leaned in. Her lips formed a word that sounded like a direction or a warning he could not fully catch. Then her gaze flicked toward the window, toward the mountain line hidden behind snow, and her hand twitched as if reaching for a map only she could see. Jack followed that glance, and outside, beyond the trees, he noticed something he had not seen before: a faint, unnatural discoloration in the snowfield far up the slope, like dust that did not belong to winter, and the dog's low, restrained growl confirmed what Jack's instincts had already decided. Whatever was hidden in the mountain was waking, and someone was about to pay for it. Snow pressed low against the mountains, dulling distance and swallowing sound, while the slopes above the valley held a tension that felt less like weather and more like restraint. Jack Miller stood at the cabin window long after the ranger's breathing settled into a fragile rhythm, his eyes fixed on the white expanse beyond the trees where the faint discoloration he had seen earlier now felt impossible to unsee. It was not the color itself that troubled him, but the implication, the sense that something had disturbed the mountain from within rather than upon its surface. He had learned long ago that landscapes behaved honestly until people taught them otherwise. The fire cracked softly behind him, and the dog remained close to the ranger, not guarding her from Jack, but from the silence that threatened to take her again. Jack forced himself to think in sequences rather than emotions, because emotions wanted to rush, and rushing was how men missed traps. He checked the ranger's pulse once more, steadier now but still weak, and allowed himself a narrow margin of relief before turning back to the problem that refused to wait. The tremor he had felt on the return climb replayed in his muscles with unsettling clarity. It had been too contained to be an avalanche, too deep to be surface collapse. Jack closed his eyes and let memory surface, not from combat, but from training exercises long buried under newer scars, moments when engineers spoke about pressure, yield, and the way Rock remembered violence long after the blast faded. He had not worked demolition, but he had lived close enough to it to recognize the language of controlled force. Mountains did not shiver without reason. He opened the sealed pouch and spread the ranger's badge and ID on the table again, not because they offered answers, but because they anchored him to the reality that someone had tried to erase. He wondered how long she had been watching whatever was happening up there before it noticed her, how many nights she had spent measuring small inconsistencies in the forest that others dismissed as winter noise. He understood that kind of vigilance intimately, the quiet certainty that danger rarely announced itself until it believed no one was listening. Jack stepped outside and let the cold sharpen his thoughts. From the clearing near the cabin, the slope above the tree line showed subtle scars only a trained eye would question, lines too straight to be wind, patches where snow clung differently, as if heat had touched the ground beneath it and then retreated. The dog followed his gaze, attention narrowing, body still, and Jack felt the familiar comfort of shared focus. He did not need the animal to tell him something was wrong. He needed the animal to confirm that he was not imagining it. Together they moved a short distance upslope, careful not to overcommit, and Jack crouched to examine a stretch of snow where the discoloration had bled outward like ash diluted by white. He brushed it aside and felt grit under his glove, not the soft crumble of rockfall, but the finer residue of pulverized stone. His jaw tightened. Someone was cutting into the mountain, and they were doing it with intent. Back inside, Jack sat on the floor with his back against the wall and let the implications stack themselves one by one. Cutting a tunnel through this range was not an act of impatience. It was an investment. The location made sense in a way that chilled him. The slope funneled toward the valley. The valley held a small town, and winter had already loaded the terrain with unstable layers. He pictured explosives placed without restraint, charges stacked because time was money, calculations rushed by people who did not have to live below their mistakes. He imagined snowpack sloughing loose, then failing catastrophically, a white wall accelerating toward roofs and roads that trusted the mountain to stay where it was. The ranger's whisper returned to him, someone else still in danger, and for the first time Jack understood that she had not been speaking only of a person. She had been speaking of a place. He moved with controlled urgency now, not panic, but purpose. He documented what he could without tools, distances paced, angles noted in memory, landmarks that would survive snowfall long enough to orient him again. He resisted the urge to go higher immediately. Impulse wanted proof. Experience demanded patience. He had one injured ranger depending on his judgment, and a town that did not yet know it was standing in the shadow of a countdown. The dog watched him pack a small kit with items that suggested observation rather than confrontation, and Jack felt a flicker of something like regret that the animal would follow him anywhere without understanding why. He rested his forehead briefly against the dog's and whispered nothing, because promises felt cheap in the face of what he suspected. When the ranger stirred again, Jack knelt beside her and offered water in careful sips. Her eyes searched his face, trying to place him within a narrative that had clearly turned hostile. He did not overwhelm her with theories. He asked only what mattered, and listened harder than he spoke. Her answers came slowly, fragmented by pain and exhaustion, but the pattern emerged with unsettling clarity. She had noticed missing markers, irregular vehicle tracks that vanished where no road existed, the absence of drone coverage where it should have been strongest. She had followed the clues uphill, believing she was days ahead of whoever was cutting into the mountain, until the mountain itself betrayed her. She had heard the blasts before she felt the blow that dropped her, and when she woke in the cold, she understood that the people responsible trusted winter more than guards. Jack absorbed this without comment, his mind already arranging contingencies. He did not tell her what he feared would happen if they continued. He did not need to add weight to her, breathing. By midday the sky thickened with cloud, the kind that flattened light and made distances lie. Jack returned to the window and studied the mountain again, counting time not by hours, but by conditions. If they were tunneling, they would be racing the season, pushing harder as storms closed access routes. If they were using explosives in volume, they would trigger micro-failures first, small warnings the mountain issued before it broke. He thought of the tremor he had felt, the ash in the snow, the way the slope seemed to hold its breath. He also thought of how invisible this threat would be to anyone without context. A town went about its winter routines, believing snow was the only danger worth respecting. Jack felt the familiar isolation of seeing what others could not yet accept, and the heavier isolation of knowing that convincing them would take time he might not have. As afternoon faded, Jack made his decision. He would go back up far enough to confirm what he already knew, not to stop it yet, but to name it. Naming things mattered. Names forced responsibility. He secured the ranger as best he could, left her with warmth and the dog's watchful presence, and stepped back into the forest with the careful economy of a man who knew every unnecessary movement borrowed against tomorrow. He climbed until the air thinned and the ground felt wrong underfoot, hollow in places where it should have been solid. There, tucked into a fold of the mountain, he found it, a crude entrance masked by branches and snow, heat bleeding faintly into the cold, the smell of chemicals unmistakable now. He did not approach closer. He did not need to. The truth stood there with the patience of a verdict. Jack retreated before dusk erased the path. On the way down, the ground shuddered again, deeper this time, a warning drumbeat that rattled through his boots and into his bones. He stopped, steadying himself, and felt the dog's absence like a missing limb before remembering the animal was back at the cabin, guarding a life that still mattered. By the time Jack reached the clearing, the mountain loomed darker against the sky, its silence no longer neutral. He shut the cabin door behind him and leaned against it, breath measured, thoughts racing despite his discipline. The ranger slept, unaware that her investigation had uncovered something that threatened far more than evidence. Jack looked once more toward the hidden slope and understood that the next move would decide whether winter claimed a town or released it. The mountain was being hollowed out, and somewhere above them, men were counting down without knowing who had begun to listen. 2 days remained before winter would be forced to choose between restraint and collapse, and deep inside the mountain, decisions were being made that did not account for the lives below. Jack Miller marked the time without clocks, measuring it instead in the way the air pressed heavier against the slopes and how the forest no longer settled after each distant vibration. The mountain had begun to complain more often now, not loudly, but insistently, like a structure pushed beyond its tolerance. From the cabin, Jack felt each muted tremor register through the soles of his boots, up his legs, and into memory, where he had learned that warnings were rarely generous enough to repeat themselves. He spent the morning moving with controlled purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, checking the ranger's condition, reinforcing the fire, rationing warmth the way he once rationed ammunition. The ranger slept in fragments, surfacing only long enough to drink water or murmur half-finished thoughts. And each time she woke, her eyes searched the room not for safety, but for urgency. She understood, even in pain, that whatever she had uncovered was still unfolding without her. By midday, Jack left her resting and returned to the tree line, choosing vantage points that offered sight lines without exposure. From higher ground, he could see more clearly what he had suspected the night before. Fresh disturbances scarred the slope in places too methodical to be natural. Snow clung unevenly, revealing faint geometric shadows beneath, and when the wind shifted just right, it carried with it the unmistakable echo of human activity buried under rock, metal striking stone, the dull resonance of work meant to remain unheard. Jack did not need to see faces to understand the structure behind it. There was organization here, hierarchy, a rhythm imposed on the mountain rather than borrowed from it. Whoever led this operation believed force could outpace consequence. Jack had met men like that before, men who treated time as something to spend recklessly because they never intended to be present when the bill arrived. He moved closer only once, enough to confirm the scale without committing himself. From concealment, he observed the site where the tunnel mouth had been disguised again after his earlier reconnaissance. Snow and branches hid it poorly to trained eyes, but well enough to discourage anyone who did not know what to question. Jack watched long enough to see figures emerge briefly, exchange signals, then vanish back into the mountain's throat. He counted movements, not people, noting efficiency rather than numbers. This was not desperation. This was a schedule. The realization settled into him with a weight that felt colder than the air. 2 days. They were accelerating. Jack returned to the cabin as the light thinned, his thoughts tightening around a single axis: prevention versus proof. Proof would come too late. Prevention required belief, and belief was not something towns offered easily to solitary men with no uniformed authority left to invoke. Inside, the ranger was awake, her breathing steadier now, pain dulled by exhaustion and stubborn will. She tried to sit up when Jack entered, and he gently stopped her, recognizing the look in her eyes. It was the same look he had worn after missions when rest felt like betrayal. He told her what he had seen without dramatizing it, trusting that clarity mattered more than fear. Her jaw tightened as she listened, and when she spoke, her voice carried anger sharpened by guilt. She told him about the instruments she had placed weeks ago, simple monitoring devices meant to track environmental changes, alarms that had begun to spike before she disappeared. She told him she had tried to report it up the chain, had been told to wait, to gather more data, to avoid confrontation until there was certainty. Jack felt something bitter coil in his chest at the familiar delay of systems designed to protect, but too slow to interrupt momentum. Against his advice, the ranger insisted on leaving the cabin by late afternoon. Not to investigate, she said, but to warn. The village below the slope lay directly in the path of any major release, its homes clustered where the mountain's runoff funneled naturally. She knew the people there. She had walked their properties, reassured them during smaller slides, taught them to read winter the way some read weather reports. Jack argued quietly, not with volume, but with precision, laying out the risks her body still carried, the likelihood she would not be believed without evidence she could not produce. She listened, then did something that unsettled him more than shouting would have. She thanked him. She thanked him for saving her life, and then said she could not live with herself if she stayed silent while the mountain prepared to fall. Jack recognized that resolve instantly. It was the same force that had once pulled him into impossible situations and kept him there long after reason suggested retreat. He did not stop her. He prepared her instead, giving her what protection he could, and watched her descend toward the village with the fragile determination of someone who knew time was running out. From the ridge above the town, Jack could see her small figure moving among houses as dusk settled, could imagine the conversations unfolding around her. He pictured doors half open, skeptical faces, the polite patience people offered warnings that threatened routine. He imagined the word crazy spoken softly, then louder, as fear disguised itself as dismissal. The ranger moved quickly, gesturing toward the mountain, toward the sky, toward the invisible math of disaster that did not care whether it was believed. Jack felt the old frustration rise in him, the knowledge that truth without authority often arrived too late to be useful. Above them all, the mountain answered with another low tremor, longer this time, the sound of stress, redistributed rather than released. Jack watched as heads turned upward briefly, curiosity flickering, then fading as nothing immediate followed. He clenched his fists and forced himself to stay still. Rage would not move the slope. Panic would not empty the village. He needed leverage, and leverage required people who understood both timing and force. As night took hold, Jack retreated back into the forest, mind already reaching backward to a network he had hoped never to disturb again. He thought of voices that would answer if he called, not because of obligation, but because of history written in shared risk. He had avoided that past for years, believing solitude was a form of penance. Now he understood that penance helped no one when action was required. When he reached the cabin, the ranger had not returned. Jack fed the fire and waited, listening to the dog's occasional low sound whenever distant noise crept too close to the cabin's perimeter. Hours passed. Finally, near midnight, a single knock cut through the stillness. Jack opened the door to find the ranger back, her face drawn with frustration rather than fear. No one had listened, she said. A few had laughed. Others had nodded and closed their doors. One man had told her winter always threatened something, and that worrying about it did not make spring arrive any faster. Jack absorbed this in silence, feeling the weight of the countdown settle fully onto his shoulders. He looked past her toward the mountain, now barely visible against the clouded sky, and made his decision. The village would not move on warnings alone. The mountain would not wait for consensus. Tomorrow Jack would stop watching and start interrupting. And somewhere deep inside the tunnel, a man who believed himself untouchable was already planning to use more force than the mountain could forgive. Before dawn, the forest held its breath, and the mountain shadow stretched toward the valley like a clock hand, pointing at consequences. Jack Miller woke with the decision already complete, the kind that settled not as courage but as alignment, when every objection finally fell silent. He moved through the cabin quietly, checking the ranger's condition with the same careful neutrality he once reserved for teammates who pretended not to be afraid, and felt the dog's attention shift, as if the animal sensed that waiting had ended. Jack did not waste time convincing himself this was right. Right was irrelevant now. Necessary was the only word that mattered. He stepped outside and keyed a device he had not powered on in years, fingers remembering sequences his mind preferred to forget, and when the line connected, voices answered that carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were familiar. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, naming the slope, the countdown, the risk that would not negotiate, and when he finished, there was no debate, only acknowledgement. The past he had kept at arm's length closed in around him, not as regret, but as readiness, and Jack felt the strange relief of no longer standing alone at the edge of a problem that demanded more than solitude. By the time the first light cut thin lines through the trees, shapes moved where none had been the night before, disciplined and quiet, arriving not as a spectacle, but as a correction to imbalance. Men he had once trusted with his life nodded without ceremony, their presence stirring something in Jack that felt like gratitude stripped of sentiment, and the plan took shape with the efficiency of minds trained to reduce chaos to options. They divided the work without argument, not because agreement was easy, but because time punished hesitation. One element would descend toward the village, carrying proof and authority enough to force evacuation where warnings had failed, while the other would move uphill with Jack and the dog to sever the operation at its source, not to punish, but to stop the clock. Jack listened as assignments were confirmed, aware of the old instinct to take the most dangerous path simply because it was his, and forced himself to accept balance instead. Leadership, he reminded himself, was choosing outcomes over pride. The ranger insisted on joining the lower team, her insistence cutting through objections with the sharpness of lived responsibility, and Jack saw in her the same refusal to let others carry the cost alone. He watched her go with a knot he did not untangle, trusting the people below to do what persuasion could not without violence, trusting the truth to finally move faster than disbelief. Above them, the mountain answered with a short tremor, as if to underline the schedule, and Jack turned uphill with the men who knew how to move unseen, the dog threading between them with purpose that required no command. As they advanced, Jack felt the return of a familiar narrowing, the way focus compressed the world into distances and probabilities, and he welcomed it not as escape, but as tool. The tunnel entrance revealed itself again through the lie of snow and the whisper of heat, and Jack's mind catalogued everything that could go wrong while refusing to dwell on any single failure. He stayed close to the dog, not to guide, but to learn, because the animal's past had been written in choices made under pressure, and Jack recognized the resonance. Inside the mountain, sounds carried differently, and Jack felt the place as much as he saw it. A hollowed presence resisting restraint, and the men around him moved with the careful aggression of those who understood that force used poorly would only accelerate disaster. They did not rush. They infiltrated, interrupting lines, severing routines, turning certainty into confusion without triggering the very collapse they were there to prevent. Jack felt the weight of each step as if it were a vote cast against the slope above the town, and when resistance appeared, it came not as surprise but as inevitability, men committed to momentum who mistook persistence for righteousness. The dog surged at the correct moment, not reckless, not savage, but precise, creating space where space was needed, and Jack felt a surge of fierce gratitude that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with trust, earned the hard way. Above ground, he imagined the other team moving door to door, voices finally carrying consequence, evacuation routes filling as doubt gave way to urgency, and he held that image as ballast against the rising pressure underground. The operation unfolded like a held breath finally released, and yet Jack knew the true test had not arrived. Men who believed in deadlines rarely surrendered when interrupted. They escalated. As they secured critical points and pushed deeper, Jack sensed the shift before it happened, the tightening that preceded a bad decision, and his thoughts flicked toward the unseen leader who would choose pride over prudence when confronted with loss of control. Jack signaled withdrawal from the deepest section, not retreat, but repositioning, and felt the subtle resistance of teammates who wanted to finish it cleanly. Then, the acceptance when they recognized the calculus. Outside, the mountain trembled again, longer now, and Jack understood with a clarity that left no room for hope as strategy that they were entering the narrowest corridor of time. He took one last look back at the darkened throat of the tunnel, feeling the pull of unfinished business like gravity, and turned toward the exit with the men and the dog moving as one, knowing that the next choice would demand a price he could not yet name but would not refuse. Deep inside the mountain, winter gave way to pressure, and the air itself seemed to wait for a mistake. Jack Miller felt it the moment they crossed the last safe threshold, the subtle shift where stone stopped absorbing sound and began reflecting it, turning every movement into a risk that could ripple far beyond its source. The tunnel narrowed ahead, reinforced crudely in places, scarred in others, and Jack understood with cold certainty that the men who built it had chosen speed over restraint. His focus tightened, not into fear but into something older and steadier, the practiced calm that arrived when consequences could no longer be postponed. The team moved with controlled urgency, dismantling what they could without triggering collapse, cutting power, severing lines, forcing progress to stutter, and for a moment Jack allowed himself to believe that interruption might be enough. Then the mountain answered back. The first blast was not the catastrophic release he feared, but a warning shot, a concussive thump that rolled through the tunnel and shook dust from the ceiling like a reprimand. Jack dropped instinctively, hands braced, breath held, listening for the sound that would follow if restraint had failed. It did not come, not yet. He signaled withdrawal, his voice steady despite the tightening in his chest, and the team began to peel back, every step calculated to avoid panic. That was when resistance hardened. Figures emerged deeper in the tunnel, movement frantic now, discipline replaced by desperation, and Jack saw the truth he had been preparing for. The leader was still inside, still counting down, still willing to trade everything below for whatever lay beyond the mountain. Shots cracked in the confined space, thunderous and dangerous, each report threatening to become a trigger. Jack fired only when it created space, not to win, but to survive long enough to retreat. The dog stayed tight to his leg, reading the chaos with an intelligence born of past trials, reacting not to noise, but to intent. Jack felt the old calculus return, the brutal arithmetic of choices where saving time meant risking lives and hesitation meant losing both. They were almost clear when the sound changed again, sharper, closer, the unmistakable click of a decision made too late to reverse. Jack knew that sound. He had heard it in other places, other wars, the moment when someone chose destruction as leverage. He shouted the order to fall back, and the team moved as one, breaking contact and racing toward the exit as the mountain seemed to inhale. Jack counted steps without numbers, feeling the tunnel pitch underfoot, hearing rock fracture in accelerating rhythms. Then something went wrong behind him, not with the mountain, but with loyalty. The dog faltered, not from fear but from injury, a sharp cry cut short as debris struck close enough to steal breath. Jack spun without thinking, the world narrowing to a single truth he could not ignore. The team was already pulling away, following orders that existed to save the many, and Jack understood the price of command in that instant. He could leave and live with the knowledge that he had abandoned the one presence that had never questioned his decisions, or he could turn back and accept whatever winter chose to take from him. Jack turned back. He did not explain. He did not hesitate. He moved toward the sound of pain as the tunnel shuddered violently, rock giving way in sheets now, snow pouring in through fractures that widened faster than thought. He reached the dog, hands closing around warmth and life, feeling the animal's effort to rise despite damage, despite instinct screaming retreat. Jack dragged them both toward what he hoped was an angle of escape, every movement heavier as the mountain began to fail in earnest. The explosion came not as sound, but as force, a pressure wave that lifted him off his feet and hurled man and dog into white chaos. The avalanche roared with a violence that erased direction, swallowing the tunnel mouth, the slope, the trees, turning the mountain into a moving ocean. Jack tumbled, senses stripped down to impact and breath, arms locking around the dog as if that embrace alone could anchor them to existence. Cold filled every space, stealing sound, stealing light, stealing time. He fought not against the snow, but within it, remembering fragments of training meant for water rather than ice, forcing motion where panic wanted stillness. He lost count of seconds, then of thought, then of everything, but the need to keep the dog's airway clear and his own mind from surrendering. When the avalanche finally spent itself, silence returned with cruel suddenness. Jack lay pinned in darkness, pressure crushing his chest, limbs numb, breath shallow and burning. He did not know how much mountain lay above him or whether anyone would ever find the place where he had vanished. He only knew the dog was still alive, pressed against him, breathing uneven but present, and that knowledge became the thin line he refused to let snap. He shifted incrementally, carving space with hands that barely responded, counting breaths like rations, listening for any change that might signal either rescue or finality. Somewhere above, he imagined his team watching the slope settle into stillness, believing the worst because experience taught them how rarely mountains returned what they took. Jack closed his eyes not in defeat but in focus, anchoring himself to the weight beside him, to the choice he had made without regret. The mountain had claimed him, but it had not finished the argument, and beneath the snow, Jack waited, breath by breath, for winter to decide whether it would keep what it had taken. Dawn returned cautiously to the mountain, light sifting across a scarred slope where snow lay unnaturally still, as if the earth itself were holding its breath after violence. Jack Miller surfaced to consciousness without ceremony, pain arriving before thought, pressure before light, the world reduced to weight and cold, and the stubborn insistence of breath. He did not know how long he had been buried or how much mountain lay above him. Time had dissolved into an internal cadence measured by the dog's breathing against his chest and his own will not to surrender it. The avalanche had ended not with silence, but with a suffocating pause, the kind that invited panic if a man allowed it, and Jack had learned long ago that panic was the only true enemy that never tired. He moved incrementally, not upward but inward, carving space with hands that felt distant, preserving air the way he once preserved ammunition, counting exhales to keep his thoughts from splintering. The dog pressed close, not seeking comfort, but offering it, an unspoken pact that neither would quit first. And Jack anchored himself to that presence because anchors did not argue. Above them the mountains settled, small secondary shifts whispering through the snow like reminders that restraint was conditional, and Jack waited until those whispers faded before daring another movement. He felt the edge of a pocket form, then widen, then collapse slightly, as snow sloughed into the space he had claimed, and he adjusted without anger, accepting the mountain's terms because refusal had never moved stone. When his fingers found air that felt different, thinner, and colder, hope threatened to surge too quickly, and he forced it down, knowing that premature belief could be fatal. He worked methodically, guided by pressure changes and instinct rather than direction, until at last light filtered in as a pale suggestion rather than a promise. He pushed, snow giving way reluctantly, and the dog surged with renewed intent, not barking, not celebrating, simply committing to the opening as if it had always known this was the path. They broke through together into a morning that felt unreal in its calm, snow drifting lightly, as if to deny what had happened hours before. And Jack fell to one knee, breath tearing into his lungs, vision swimming as the mountain finally released its claim. He did not look back at the slope. He did not need to. He knew what it had tried to take and what it had failed to keep. The dog stood beside him, steadying, without instruction, eyes scanning not for threats but for signals of belonging, and Jack followed that gaze downslope, where movement cut through the white like an answer to prayer. Figures crested the rise cautiously, then broke into motion when they saw him, relief collapsing into urgency, voices carrying his name with disbelief threaded through it. The team reached him first, hands firm and practiced, checking for injuries, counting breaths, confirming what they had not allowed themselves to believe during the long hours of searching when the slope offered only stillness. Jack let them work, consciousness narrowing again, not from weakness, but from release. And when he finally spoke, it was to ask about the village, because outcomes mattered more than survival stories. He listened as they told him the evacuation had held, that houses stood empty when the snow roared through, that what was lost could be rebuilt because lives had not been spent to preserve routine, and something loosened in his chest that he had kept locked for years. Down below, the town gathered not as an audience, but as witnesses, the line between rumor and truth finally erased by consequence, avoided rather than endured, and when Jack was guided toward them, the reaction surprised him with its warmth. There were cheers, yes, but also quiet gratitude, hands pressed together, eyes damp with the recognition that catastrophe had brushed past and moved on. The rangers stood among them, steadier now, watching with an expression that carried both relief and resolve. And when Jack met her gaze, he saw not hero worship, but acknowledgement, the shared understanding of people who had seen the edge and chosen not to look away. The dog moved through the cluster without hesitation, accepting touches without claiming them, returning to Jack's side as if to remind him that stories tended to exaggerate men and forget what made them possible. Authorities arrived in the wake of certainty, methodical and late, cataloging what remained of the tunnel operation, detaining those who had believed speed absolved them of responsibility, and Jack watched without satisfaction because justice delivered after prevention felt like a footnote rather than a climax. He declined attention with the same economy he once declined rest, redirecting it instead toward the work ahead, stabilizing slopes, rebuilding trust, ensuring the mountain's warnings were finally respected. News traveled faster than snowmelt, and within days the story of a seal and his dog spread far beyond the valley, polished by retelling into something Jack barely recognized. But he accepted it with a humility that surprised him because he understood what it gave others: permission to believe that vigilance still mattered. He did not stay long after recovery allowed him to walk unaided. Fame was a weather system he had no interest in enduring, and the dog sensed his restlessness, ready to move when he was. Before leaving, Jack stood once more at the edge of the forest with the ranger, speaking little, their shared silence carrying more respect than promises ever could. And then he turned toward the cabin that had sheltered a beginning and now felt complete. Winter continued its work, snow falling with indifference that no longer felt hostile, and Jack walked into it, not as a legend but as a man who had chosen responsibility over isolation when it counted, the dog pacing him with quiet pride born not of victory but of fidelity. When the trees closed around them and the town disappeared behind white and distance, Jack felt something settle that he had not known was still searching for a place to land, a sense that the past had finally loosened its grip, not erased, not forgiven, but integrated, and that was enough. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come quietly, disguised as timing, as endurance, as a choice made when no one is watching. In this story, the mountain did not move because of strength alone. It moved because someone refused to walk away, because loyalty stood firm when fear demanded surrender, and because grace chose to pass through human hands instead of around them. Some will call what happened coincidence. Others will call it luck. But those who have walked long enough through winter know a different truth. God often works not by removing the storm, but by placing someone inside it at the exact moment they are needed. In our own lives, we may feel buried by silence, by loss, by time itself. Yet even beneath the heaviest weight, breath can remain, hope can remain. And sometimes the way out begins with a single act of faith, a single step taken when all seems still. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be carrying a hidden burden tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, so we can stand together across distance. And if you believe in stories of quiet courage, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with us. May God bless you, protect you, and meet you exactly where you are. And may you never forget that even in the coldest seasons of life, love still finds its way home.